pursuing other ends, such as wealth, honor, and pleasure, are in many cases transformed into tyrannies when other ends are attained. The idea, especially in a contemporary setting, is that there really is an inability to, quote unquote, attain capital as an end. You can't attain capital. Right? You approach, maximum wealth, but there's always more money to be had, which I would say is a better end, political end, than tyranny. And it's precisely that end, capital as end, and the inability to attain capital as end, that allows those regimes that posit capital as end from becoming tyrannical. Right? It's sort of deep, nuanced point, but I think that's important. Need to wrap this up. This bit. The satisfaction of these desires seems to free the citizens of bad regimes to pursue the highest evil, ignorant and erring regimes. That is, the view of tyranny as the good. Right? There is a sense in which authors talk about the summum bonum, the greatest good. There is a sense in which we can talk about the greatest evil. And the greatest evil, in a secular sense, really is, and this is undeniable, and this is historically validated time and time again, the greatest secular evil is a political regime which has undeniably posited tyranny as end, either internally or internationally. Right? Once the political regime becomes tyrannical and mobilizes all of its political might and forces against the people to destroy the people for no other end than the preservation of destruction and power. And not, I can't even say power, because it's not the preservation of power, but the propagation of subjugation, then that's for no other purpose than that. That's the greatest evil known to man. It always has been, and it always will be. Right? War as an end in itself is for Al-Farabi a supreme vice. Right? Supreme vice that can have no place in the regime whose end is supreme virtue. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, and then I'll continue in a moment with the next bit because I'm over the hour mark. Okay, so the next bit, bottom of page 8 of my notes, here's a direct quote. We're going to talk about the non-virtuous regimes, right? And according to Al-Farabi, there are 4 of these non-virtuous regimes. So let's take a look at what these non-virtuous regimes are, and specifically analyze what I think will be a bit of an interesting dilemma. I mean, so far up until this point, I think the discussion has directly applied. It'll be interesting to see how this applies, this bit. So, 4 non-virtuous regimes. The first is the primacy of honor, right? And this is democracy. Okay? So the democracy is the first non-virtuous regime, the primacy of honor. The second is the primacy of the few. And this is plutocracy, P-L-U-T-O-C-R-A-C-Y. And this is the rulership-based, the primacy of the few, rulership based on wealth. Number 3 is the primacy of the assembly of the multitude. I love how that sounds, right? The primacy of the assembly of the multitude, right? And this is a democracy. Which isn't any surprise, right? I underlined democracy when I should have underlined something else. And this is the multitude, right? And then number 4 is the primacy of tyranny, right? Okay. So honor, wealth, the masses, and tyranny. We see specifically, obviously what I'm interested in is the discussion of democracy. democracy, as is no surprise, both for Plato and notoriously Aristotle, and now Al-Farabi, is the worst form of governance, right? Democracy is the worst form of governance precisely because the form of governance, what does he say? The assembly of the masses, right? The assembly of the multitude, right? The satisfaction, we'll see in a second, the attempt to satisfy the desires of this population posits one of the worst forms of governance, right? Obviously, the worst form of governance would be the tyranny. A tyrannical regime, which he just said, posits war and the propagation of war as the supreme end, the supreme evil. But let's look what Al-Farabi has to say about the democratic regime. So it begins well, right? It doesn't sound too bad at first, but rather quickly it sort of degrades into an outright rejection of democratic, quote unquote, democratic principles. We'll see why I said quote unquote in a second. Some of the stuff I'm not going to write down because it's rather obvious, right? So freedom is posited as the first principle. Okay, fine. So when we talk about well, actually I will write this down. Democracy. Democracy. Basically, what is democracy? And this is didn't you say Dr. Campbell is supposed to be advanced theories in political philosophy? What is democracy? That's a rather trite question. Okay, we'll see. Okay, so freedom is posited as the first principle. The democratic regime emerges from the association of the free. Right? I like that. So when we talk about freedom, we're talking about an association. Right? So you think an association looks something like, association looks something like this. You get the idea. I'm not going to draw it the full. Right? Association, where each dot represents an individual. Right? An association of the free. Okay. Next page, page 9. Equality. Right? These are the ideas. Equality is posited as the second principle. But here's the problem, right? The idea is, if we, by democracy, mean freedom and equality, which are obviously talking points, the question is, what do we, as a philosopher, right, epistemologically, what do we mean when we say freedom? What do we mean when we say equality, right? If we define democracy by freedom and equality, well, we have a real difficult problem even understanding what it is that democracy is, because the definition of equality and freedom in terms of the social appropriation of these concepts to people is a very hard thing to understand. How do you talk about equality? And we'll talk about that in a second, right? So problem with equality. There's essentially no distinction between, this is a direct quote, right? There's essentially no distinction between the ruler and the ruled. Can you talk about equality in a democracy if you posit a ruler? Yes or no? Why? Blah, blah, blah. I'm not here to answer it. Just here to, like Wittgenstein says, philosopher readily kick up dust and then complain they can't see. Right? It's like I'm kicking up some dirt and, you figure it out. But the idea is really important, right? When we talk about equality, what do we really mean? This is, I'll give you an appropriate contemporary application, which I think is actually right. So I'm a bit of a Rawlsian buff. Where's my, I don't know if I still have it. Do I have it? I thought I had it. No, I don't have Rawls. I thought I always have it. Yeah, I don't have Rawls. But I had, it's probably at the house. But Rawls' theory of justice, there is a sense in which his initial account was an account, arguably, of equality. And the account of equality, obviously, when we go behind the veil of ignorance, we act in such a manner that our actions facilitate those who are least advantaged. And you do this sort of depersonalized, conceptual, it's just absolutely genius. But it was amended quite a bit to do away with the idea of equality for obviously many reasons, depersonalization being one of them, privilege being a second of them, and he rather talked about opportunity, right? So that the discussion in the contemporary sense, and this is a very, very nuanced point, is when we talk about democracy, are we really, are are we really talking